Hi, everyone. I'm Rena 9, and thank you for joining us. Right now, Congress is being briefed on the rising tensions between the U.S. and Iran. The briefing is being led by senior officials in the Trump administration. That includes Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Mark Esper. 8 senior members of Congress received the same briefing yesterday before Iran issued its retaliation for the U.S. airstrike that killed one of its top commanders. General Qasem Soleimani. Tehran launched missile strikes on 2 bases in Iraq where U.S. troops are stationed. The Al-Assad Air Base and the Erbil Air Base. Both are more than 100 miles from the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. Video from state TV shows the Iranian military launching the missiles on the 2 bases. There were no American or Iraqi casualties in the attack. A defense official tells CBS News that the U.S. had, quote, multiple hours of warning prior to the attack, giving troops plenty of time to take shelter in bunkers. On Twitter, Iran's foreign minister called the strike proportionate measures. He also said, quote, we do not seek escalation or war, but will defend ourselves against any aggression. In remarks earlier today, President Trump slammed the Iran nuclear deal and announced new sanctions on Tehran. He also praised the U.S. military for taking proper precautions to prevent casualties.
Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well.
I want to bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe from Capitol Hill. So, Ed, the president said there's going to be more sanctions imposed. Is this a solution that you see lawmakers on both sides welcoming, and do you really see that happening soon?
Well, you said on both sides. We'll see. It depends on what exactly they are and for what reason. But obviously there are sanctions right now. I think the bigger question as these briefings get underway this afternoon is members in both parties looking for answers to what exactly was the specific imminent threat against American interests that General Soleimani was working on at the time of his death. And what exactly, for example, would the United States do now to bring in NATO? The president in one sentence mentions that he'd like NATO to take a more active role in Iraq and in this situation, but didn't get into details about exactly what that would be. And when he says at the end of his speech he's seeking peace, well, what would that look like? Who would negotiate on behalf of the administration? That also wasn't clear. Ahead of these briefings today, ahead of the president's speech, nearly 40 House Democrats who will be in attendance at this briefing put out a letter with about 8 detailed questions to the administration. Among other things, what is the specific imminent threat, as I mentioned? How's the administration working with NATO? What contingency plans do they have to defeat ISIS, given that that may in some ways be sort of on the back burner? How do recent U.S. military actions advance the president's stated campaign pledge to end endless wars in the Middle East? And would he seek legal authority from Congress should he need to take more military action against Iran? That issue of military, whether or not there should be a debate over future authorized use of military force is up in the air today, with Democrats saying they'd still like to look into that, but no specifics yet on what exactly that legislation would look like and when a vote would be held.
I want to also bring in Hunter Walker. He's a White House correspondent for Yahoo News. Hunter, we heard Ed talk a little bit about the president's push for more NATO support on this. The president hasn't always been welcoming to some of our allies, particularly on the issue of Iran. There hasn't been a united front when you look at a lot of these European countries. Is there support coming from other countries and world leaders? Does the White House feel confident they'll get that on this situation with Iran?
Well, there's a lot that's really muddled about the message we're receiving from the White House now. As Ed was pointing out, the president sort of brought up NATO in this quick one sentence, but he's been very critical of NATO involvement and other countries' contributions to NATO in the past. He also said he's willing to seek peace, but, he's been very critical of the past negotiations with Iran. And in general, I think, this entire conflict that we've seen with Iran these past few months has been really confusing. I mean, as Ed was also saying, President Trump campaigned saying he would end, quote unquote, endless wars. At the same time, he also, has set up very aggressive red lines with Iran. He pulled us out of the nuclear deal. When they seemed to violate those red lines by shooting down a drone this summer, we did back away from escalation there. This time, just yesterday, President Trump was saying if they did anything to target Americans or American assets, the response would come and it would be, quote, very strongly. And obviously, it doesn't seem to be the kind of response that we're having now. So I think there's a lot of clarity missing from this message from the White House.
When you talk about clarity also, Hunter, does the White House, while they're hopeful, they want some sort of diplomatic negotiations, what exactly would that look like? And are they still on high alert? Do they believe that another attack could be coming from Iran?
I don't know for sure, but I would imagine they are very much on high alert. I mean, this response was very, very measured from Iran. We're seeing reporting this morning that they, may have actually specifically tried to evade having casualties. There have been some diplomatic back channels, notably with Oman, Qatar, the French and the Swiss. I know the French President Emmanuel Macron was speaking with Rouhani in Iran yesterday, and I think the international community is very, very eager to see a decrease in tensions. But I think with that lack of clarity that we were talking about around what the Trump doctrine is and what President Trump really wants with Iran, it makes it a little harder to figure out in a concrete way, who would be the players and how tensions would be taken down here.
Ed, you mentioned the House's potential vote soon on a new authorization of military force. Before the president's speech, you actually asked House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel why this situation in Iran is different from the others in years past. Here's what they had to say.
I think in light of what's happened with Iran, I think it's different. I think there are a lot of people, myself included, who are fed up with no declarations of war, all kinds of things happening, and Congress is out of the loop. That's not what the Constitution provides for, and so it's something that I think more and more people are uncomfortable with.
And is there a sense of how House Democrats plan to approach this issue with Iran?
Well, there was a conversation with the House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer a little while ago. He told reporters that the plan is to try to button this up in the coming days. They've got a few different options on the table. One is essentially a new, what's called AUMF up here, authorized use of military force, the one that sort of gives an administration blanket approval to take military action under specific conditions. Remember, the United States has been operating under one passed in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. It still mentions things like Al-Qaeda, which really isn't the threat that it used to be. Grave concern that the actions taken in recent months against the leader of ISIS and then General Soleimani last week fall far outside the scope of this. And remember, and this is what I said to Chairman Engel, at least once a year up here, some global crisis occurs and there's some kind of military response, and Republicans and Democrats together in both chambers say, we got to have another debate over a new AUMF. We got to get this done, and then it sizzles out within a few days or weeks. We'll see whether or not it's different this time, especially given now that after last night's events, we may be entering a sort of a phase of de-escalation, and Democrats run the risk of looking a little too reactionary or political in response to something that very well, in the long run, may lead to potential negotiations with Iran. But they also have a few other things on the table. For example, there's a proposal to completely repeal the old AUMF, which would require then everything to fall under this new one. That's something that liberal Democrats are seeking. And another that essentially would require explicit congressional approval were certain actions to be taken in the future. So again, whether or not that actually happens remains to be seen, because one of the dirty secrets of these kinds of debates up here, Rena, is if you hold that kind of debate, it means lawmakers in both parties actually have to vote on it. And it's the kind of vote that can come back to haunt you. John Kerry had this problem in 2004 with votes like this. Joe Biden is facing criticism right now over his support of the Iraq War out on the presidential campaign trail. And they all know that you may have been on the right side of history in the moment you take that vote, but that circumstances change later and make this a more politically derisive issue.
Speaking of politically divisive issues, I want to turn to impeachment, Ed, while I have you. On the Senate floor this morning, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell insisted House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has no leverage in her decision to hold the articles of impeachment. I want to play for you what he had to say.
There will be no haggling with the House over Senate procedure. We will not cede our authority to try this impeachment. The House Democrats' turn is over. The Senate has made its decision.
And why is Pelosi continuing with this strategy, and do we know what her next move might be?
We don't, because if you ask any member of the House Democratic Caucus, they say, ask Speaker Pelosi. It's up to her to decide when and how this will happen, and it will be up to her to announce when exactly she's made that decision. I tell you, everything that was up is down, everything that's down is up, black is white, white is black, because a month ago, remember, Democrats were pushing to get this done as quickly as possible, claiming that they were running out of time, and the calendar and the clock were a part of their concern in getting this done before the holidays. Now suddenly you talk to House Democrats and they're like, oh, we'll take all the time in the world to ensure that we have a fair trial. Mitch McConnell turns around and says, no, as he said there, you have no leverage over here in the Senate. We're going to run this show. You don't get a say. And today, we see a rift now between Democrats in the House and in the Senate. Senators like Chris Murphy and Richard Blumenthal, both of Connecticut, telling reporters, maybe a good idea for the House to send over those articles of impeachment. You talk to members of the House, David Cicilline, Jamie Raskin, two members of the relevant committees who've been vocal defenders of this process so far. Hey, what's the holdup? Why aren't you sending this over? Why don't you want to rush this through as you were last month? And they go, hey, we're going to take all the time in the world because the Constitution says we should. So it is incredible to watch how the holiday season has sort of changed the game up here, and we'll see how quickly Speaker Pelosi may move. Remember, even once she's ready to do that, there are some mechanical things she has to do, some logistical things. She's got to pick the managers, or essentially the people who will present the case to the Senate. That is a tricky casting decision, the likes of which folks in Hollywood or down the hall from you, Rena, frankly, have never seen before. And then they've got to decide who exactly would make this case to the Senate. And she's got lots of options and a lot of people eager to do it. And then there'll be a question in the Senate of when exactly this trial begins. And it has the potential to complicate the presidential campaign because there's supposed to be a debate next week that the DNC now says they would consider moving were the impeachment trial underway by then.
All right. You know, Hunter, as this impasse continues, what does the White House want to see from McConnell? Do they believe that this trial should start immediately?
Well, I think the White House is very, very confident in Leader McConnell and the Republican members of the Senate. You know, they believe that this is sort of a do-over of the Mueller probe and part of an extended partisan effort to oust the president. And the White House has, raised procedural objections throughout to this House inquiry. And I think they're quite confident that at the very least, Leader McConnell is firmly with them in that front. But I think the question is more about more moderate Republicans in the Senate. Obviously, in order for the president to be removed from office, you need about 20 Republican senators to kind of vote against him, and that's very, very unlikely. But on some of these procedural questions, a straight-up majority would do it. So just a couple of Republican defections, could change issues such as how many witnesses are allowed to testify and the order of the proceedings. And I think that's what Nancy Pelosi is backing on. I mean, I do not purport to know when she's actually going to introduce these articles, but, I've talked to sources familiar with the situation, and I think, she's fairly confident that if she drags this out, kind of public opinion is on her side, and you could see some of those moderate Republicans breaking as we see public opinion in favor of impeachment.